So Alex Jones's company Infowars filed for bankruptcy. Does this mean he'll get out of paying damages to the parents of the Sandy Hook victims? Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. Well, I've got a longtime friend and a former student of mine who's been urging me for some time to do a video about Alex Jones. Now, I can understand his concern about Alex Jones. I share his concern, and I've really been deeply disturbed, as all of you know, for some time by the move of the Republican Party into being a party that no longer relies on facts, that instead kind of creates their own reality and will make arguments based upon made-up conspiracy theories rather than trying to argue about actual policy disputes. Alex Jones was certainly at the forefront of this movement, and interestingly enough, before Donald Trump came along, he was kind of viewed as this crank, this guy out in left field who says all kinds of crazy stuff. It's only when Donald Trump did come into office that suddenly we realized the kind of corrosive influence that this kind of alternative fact basis can do to our democracy. At this point, if anything, the Republican Party has become a wing of the Alex Jones conspiracy theory, as opposed to simply a political party that differs in its perspective from the Democratic Party. These conspiracy theories rely upon essentially motivated reasoning, where people will start with a certain idea that they want to push forward, and then try to find facts that support that argument. Now, as the arguments become more and more ludicrous, then obviously they rely less on actual facts and simply make up the facts to kind of suit what they're trying to argue. So, for example, as a lot of people have pointed out, I wish that Republicans were as concerned about keeping guns out of schools as they are about keeping textbooks out of schools. Unfortunately, in the United States, we've developed almost this cult of the gun based upon the Second Amendment. Now, interestingly enough, I'm actually somebody, having read the Second Amendment, who believes that it actually provides pretty broad support and protection to gun rights here in the United States. I don't like it. I wish that we could have more gun control like they do, say, in Australia, for example. But unfortunately, that's not the law here in the United States. And I still believe that the United States is a nation of laws, even though, again, our opponents don't seem to agree with that view. I do think that the Second Amendment, though, severely limits our ability to do anything about the guns in people's hands. That being said, no right is absolute. And government can put some limits on rights based upon the health, safety, and welfare of the community at large. And we frequently do put limits on rights. I mean, there's that famous saying about yelling fire in a crowded movie theater, that's not protected by freedom of speech. Well, similarly, you could certainly make the case that allowing people to bring guns into schools is something that would not be protected by the Second Amendment. However, again, we've kind of fetishized almost guns here in the United States to the extent where any kind of effort to regulate guns in any way, shape, or form is viewed as a fundamental attack on the Second Amendment. Now, this is made worse, by the way, by the NRA and other gun groups. As you know, the NRA itself has filed for bankruptcy and has been going through quite the difficult times right now. Not that we should feel bad for them at all. But these gun groups have essentially made money by stoking the fear of the most loyal gun owners. And the problem is, in the United States, we're pretty permissive when it comes to guns. So what the gun rights groups have to do is they need to keep pressing further, finding some new issue to essentially rile up their base about and generate more contributions. That's why we've gotten things like the proliferation in this country of stand your ground gun laws. Something that's absurd. I mean, it's pretty fundamental in American law that the goal should be to de-escalate a situation. You shouldn't have a right to shoot someone just because you don't like the fact that they're being aggressive to you. But yet that kind of Wild West mentality seems to be exactly what's promoted by these gun groups. Furthermore, they're continually arguing that, the Democrats are coming to take your guns away, which of course is absurd given the fact that not a single person has lost a gun as a result of a Democrat being in office. Nevertheless, they need to continue to stoke that fear so they're able to continue to generate contributions and essentially rile up the base for their elections. So that's where Alex Jones comes in. You see, after the shooting at the Sandy Hook Elementary School and the horrible scenes that we saw about that, you could imagine that kind of put these gun advocates into a pretty tough position. I mean, in the wake of that type of violence, senseless violence, how could somebody still defend allowing guns into schools? Well, in comes Alex Jones making the claim that these parents were making the whole thing up. In a move reminiscent of Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump for that matter, they simply claimed that, oh, this was something false, they made it up. And at one point, Alex Jones had pointed to a video where, because of the way that the person who was being interviewed moved his head, Alex Jones argued that it was a fake video that was produced in a studio. Well, these statements were completely false. They were defamatory, and they led to serious harm to these individuals. Many of these individuals, the parents of victims of a school shooting, have been harassed by right-wing nuts and have had to move several times and essentially hide their identity for fear of the harassment that these people have been giving them. Thus came the lawsuits against Alex Jones and Infowars. Now, in one of the more shocking turns of events, Alex Jones has essentially refused to cooperate with the court in these cases. Rather than actually defending himself, he's refused to do things like go to a deposition or turn over certain documents that were ordered by the court. You see, part of the lawsuit process is something called discovery, where essentially both sides need to turn over information to the other side. Now, this might seem very contrary to a lot of people who think that somehow you should be able to essentially keep your arguments to yourself until the actual court case, but that's not the way the American legal system works. You're supposed to win or lose based upon the evidence that you're able to present and the strength of your arguments. So as one judge said to me, we don't have litigation by surprise here. Scratch that. So Alex Jones's failure to respect orders by the court to participate in this discovery process ultimately led to such frustration by the judges that they granted what are called default judgments to the plaintiffs, where essentially, basically, even before a trial was held, and not based upon the evidence itself, the court granted a judgment to the plaintiffs because of the fact that essentially the defendant was refusing to play by the rules. Well, Alex Jones, of course, seems to believe that the rules don't apply to him, so I guess it makes sense that he would behave like this. But ultimately, when you're dealing with judges in U.S. courts, such arguments usually don't stand up so well. So now Alex Jones has filed bankruptcy as a result of these millions of dollars worth of judgments that are coming at him, right? Well, not so fast. The actual bankruptcy filing was by Infowars and two other of his companies, IW Health and Prison Planet TV. Now, under American law, of course, these are separate entities. As corporate entities, they are separate people under the law from Alex Jones. This is kind of a concept that's really foreign to people who aren't familiar with American law, but to us steeped in our legal system here, it makes total sense. It's as if Alex Jones did not personally file bankruptcy, but three other people filed bankruptcy. That's the way the law views it. And as it turns out, Alex Jones himself, personally, is a defendant in these lawsuits. These other companies might actually also be defendants in the lawsuits. So certainly they're liable for any damages that the court finds with respect to them. But Alex Jones himself is also liable for them. What's more is the bankruptcy code has included certain provisions in it that are what they call exceptions to discharge. Essentially, those are certain kinds of debt that the law says will not be discharged as a result of a bankruptcy proceeding. Most famously, some of those debts include things like alimony, for example, and child support. They also include student loans, as everybody is aware. Now, the provision of the bankruptcy code that especially jumped out at me with this regard is section 523A6. Let me read that provision to you. It reads that a discharge under section blah, blah, blah of this title does not discharge an individual debtor from any debt, and section 6 reads, for willful and malicious injury by the debtor to another entity or to the property of another entity. So to the extent that these defamation lawsuits are alleging that Alex Jones's actions were alleged and malicious, the bankruptcy code even says those debts would not be discharged. The bankruptcy code does not protect people from essentially harming people on purpose. So what is Alex Jones trying to do here? Well, to understand that better, we only need to look at the Sacklers. Oh yes, we remember the Sacklers. They're the owners of Purdue Pharma, famous for giving us the opioid epidemic here in the United States. Well, the Sacklers tried an interesting maneuver where essentially they had their companies, Purdue Pharma, file for bankruptcy. And then what they did is essentially had the lawyers for the companies go and argue to the court that not only should a settlement in the bankruptcy court protect the companies from future litigation, but the settlement that would be paid by the companies would also protect the Sacklers themselves. This is exactly the situation that Alex Jones is in. The Sacklers themselves were held liable in addition to their companies for these debts. The company files bankruptcy, and then the company tries to get the bankruptcy protection for the company to also flow over and protect the owner. Now, the bankruptcy court in the Purdue Pharma case said no, which was the correct decision, by the way, because under American law, there's no basis to essentially say that a bankruptcy by one person is also going to protect somebody else who did not file bankruptcy. That's not the way the law works. And again, you have to remember, under American law, the company may as well be a separate person from Alex Jones or the Sacklers, even though they own them. Now, the reason this matters is that when you go into the bankruptcy court, you have to disclose everything you own and everybody you owe money to. That kind of disclosure can lead to the discovery of certain assets that will enable the creditors to be compensated and get money that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So the fact that the Sacklers themselves did not submit to the authority of the bankruptcy court means that they should not get the protection that filing bankruptcy should give them. Because again, they didn't go through the process. They didn't have to disclose everything to the court. Well, my guess is that's exactly what's going to happen with Alex Jones as well. His companies might have filed bankruptcy, but that's not going to protect him from any kind of personal liability. The companies may try to argue that, we'll pay some money to the claimants in these lawsuits as long as these payments also result in protection from future lawsuits, both to the companies and to Alex Jones. And again, based upon the decision in the Purdue Pharma case, that's not going to fly. What's more is, even if Alex Jones himself files bankruptcy, that's not necessarily going to protect him from any kind of liability for this behavior. Under American law, defamation, what Alex Jones is accused of, is considered an intentional tort, exactly the kind of claim that is accepted from discharge under the Bankruptcy Code section 523A6. So if Alex Jones thinks he's getting out of these debts as a result of the bankruptcy court, think again. The law is not on his side, and I think the families of the Sandy Hook victims are going to get the compensation they're due, which is at least a little bit of justice in one of the great tragedies of this country. Well, if you want to find out more about how the Sacklers tried to use the bankruptcy courts to avoid any kind of personal liability for their bad behavior with respect to the opioid crisis, why don't you check out this video over here? As I say, the judge ruled correctly in that case, fortunately. And now I assume the Sacklers are trying to figure out a way to get out of that liability. Well, I'll see you in that video. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.